$40-50 million?
Over probably 8 sessions, 8 or 10 sessions.
Heads up, or just like...
Yeah, just heads up, just me and him. There was one point when I was beating him and we've been playing for 2 days straight and I had $18 million in front of me. And if he said all in, I had to make a decision for $18 million. That's going to happen. And I mean, I'd like to be fucking president. And I think it's like a realistic thing. I know people laugh at that, but I think if I make billions of dollars and I give it away, the bulk of it, I mean, you could probably keep like 500 million, so I'm uncorruptible.
There's rich, there's famous, and then there's Dan Bilzerian, the man who didn't just live a wild life. He monetized the fantasy of it. He made millions believe he was untouchable. Flying private jets, partying on yachts, surrounded by models, cash, and guns. A modern-day Gatsby with a beard and a flamethrower. He claimed he made $50 million playing poker. He told the world he bought a $65 million mansion. He said he built his own company, ran it, and made it profitable. But what if none of that was real? What if the mansion was rented, the poker winnings were unverifiable, the women were hired, and the entire brand was a house of cards, propped up by investor money and Instagram filters? Except there's no proof he ever did, because behind the parties, behind the persona, and behind the Instagram curtain was a web of lies, lawsuits, and a father who'd already been convicted of financial fraud. The same father who, despite a lifetime SEC ban, may have secretly been running the company Dan was supposed to own. And it gets worse. By 2024, the US government stepped in. Ignite was being investigated for fraud. Investors were fleeing. Followers were unfollowing in droves. And Dan? He went silent. Until 2025, when he filed a $50 million lawsuit against his own father. This is the story of how Dan Bilzerian became a symbol of wealth, power, and male fantasy, only to be exposed as a carefully constructed illusion. And the truth, it's stranger than anything he ever posted online. There's rich, and then there's whatever the hell Dan Bilzerian was. At the height of his fame, he wasn't just flexing money. He was selling a lifestyle so outrageous, it looked like a video game set to real life. Private jets, gold-plated machine guns, a different woman draped across him in every post. If there was ever a character engineered to hypnotize the algorithm, it was Dan. Rugged beard, icy stare, and more abs than accountability. He wasn't a businessman. He was the business, or so it seemed. But what most people didn't realize back then was that this entire empire was built on one unverified claim, that Dan Bilzerian made tens of millions playing poker. No one ever saw receipts, no tournament trophies, just one man telling the world he crushed private games with millionaires who didn't know better. Sounds impressive. But as the years passed, poker pros began to ask, where's the evidence? Even Dan's biggest fans couldn't point to a single high-stakes victory that explained how he could afford that $200,000 per month mansion, that arsenal of military-grade weapons, or the endless fleet of supercars. But here's the thing, none of that mattered back then, because Dan wasn't trying to be respected. He wanted to be worshipped. His formula was simple. Flaunt a fantasy life so loud, no one stops to ask how it's funded. And for a while it worked. Millions followed, brands signed on, and Dan Bilzerian became the undisputed king of living like a legend. But the cracks were already forming, and what would be exposed next would change everything. Behind the bikini-clad models and $10,000 dinners, Dan Bilzerian had a real company, at least on paper. It was called Ignite, and it was supposed to sell CBD, vapes, and wellness products. But what it actually became was a glorified ATM for Dan's fantasy lifestyle. In 2019 alone, Ignite lost a jaw-dropping $50 million. That's not a typo. According to their financial statements, most of that wasn't spent on product development or marketing. It was blown on renting mansions, throwing parties, and covering Dan's personal expenses. We're talking $75,000 on a paintball field, $26,000 for image promotion, aka hiring women to hang out with him, nearly $900,000 to fund Dan's jet-setting, yacht-hopping, champagne-pouring existence. And Dan had a genius way of justifying it all. He slapped the Ignite logo on everything. A party wasn't personal if it was brand promotion. A luxury car wasn't indulgent. It was a prop. He turned life into a commercial, but the company wasn't seeing any returns. The CEO at the time, Curtis Heffernan, saw the red flags early. A former Procter & Gamble exec, he tried to play it straight. He raised concerns. He told Dan to tone it down. And when COVID hit, he told Dan to stop throwing massive, rule-breaking pool parties. Dan's response? Fire him. And that's when the real bomb dropped. Heffernan filed a lawsuit, and with it, he exposed everything. The mansion Dan claimed to own for $65 million. He didn't buy it. He rented it for $200K a month. The private jets, leased. The followers, many were bought. The women, paid brand ambassadors. Suddenly, the Instagram king looked less like a billionaire playboy and more like a reckless CEO spending investor money to fund a fantasy. But that wasn't the whole story. For years, Dan Bilzerian paraded his massive Beverly Hills mansion as proof of success. He told anyone who asked, and plenty who didn't, that he bought it outright for $65 million. In one now infamous clip, he even gave Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank a tour of the place, bragging about his investment. Turns out there was nothing to deduct, because the house wasn't his. He was renting it, and the lease, $200,000 per month. That's right, the Instagram king was posing in a palace he didn't own, using investor money to keep up the illusion. And it didn't stop at the mansion. Expense reports revealed an entire lifestyle built on lies. $26,000 to pay women just to be seen with him. Luxury yachts, flights, and parties all billed to ignite, invoices labeled as marketing that had no actual marketing value. Every outrageous image you saw on his feed, paid for. Every flex, every backdrop, every living the dream post, just another entry in Ignite's bloated budget. When the reports leaked, it wasn't just finance nerds who took notice. Social media turned on him. Comments flooded in, mocking him as Rent King and the Budget Playboy. And worst of all, the followers started leaving. In just a few months, over 60,000 people unfollowed him. On March 31st, 2024 alone, he lost 5,419 followers in 24 hours. A record-breaking drop, not in stock but in reputation. The illusion had cracked, and with it, the brand that made Dan famous began to collapse. But the story was far from over, because what came next would involve the US government. By this point, Dan Bilzerian wasn't just losing followers, he was losing control, because behind the Instagram filters and flashy parties, something darker was unfolding. The US Securities and Exchange Commission, and later the Department of Justice, had started paying attention, not to the lifestyle, but to the money behind it. In September 2024, federal authorities dropped a bombshell. Dan's company, Ignite, along with his father, Paul Bilzerian, and longtime associate Alex Rohleder, were hit with criminal charges, including securities fraud and wire fraud. The accusations were staggering. Prosecutors claimed Ignite had inflated its revenue numbers, cooked the books, and misled investors. According to the SEC's report, the company faked over $5 million in revenue in late 2020, right around the time Dan was bragging online about Ignite's first profitable quarter. Turns out that miracle profit? It was an illusion, just like the lifestyle. But here's where it gets even more twisted. While Dan was playing the role of hard-partying CEO, the real power, the one pulling strings in the shadows, may have been his father all along. That name might not mean much to younger viewers, but for those who remember, Paul Bilzerian was a notorious Wall Street villain. In the early 90s, he was convicted of financial fraud, fined $62 million, and served prison time. The SEC had banned him for life from running any US public company. And yet, investigators say Paul was still heavily involved in Ignite's decisions. Thousands of internal emails showed him guiding the company from behind the scenes, all while maintaining the illusion that Dan was the one in charge. If true that it's a direct violation of his lifetime ban and a time bomb for Ignite, it wasn't just a lifestyle built on deception, it was a corporate structure built on illegal foundations. And in case you're wondering what Dan did when this all came out, he didn't post flashy rebuttals, he didn't show up to defend himself, he went quiet, but someone else did speak on the company's behalf, and it was a face no one expected to see again. Just when it seemed like Dan Bilzerian's empire couldn't fall any further, he did the unthinkable. In early 2025, Dan filed a lawsuit against his own father, Paul Bilzerian, the same man who had allegedly been running Ignite from the shadows, the same man Dan had spent years claiming he barely spoke to. Now, he was accusing him of betrayal on a corporate scale. Dan's lawsuit didn't hold back. He claimed his father, along with Ignite's CFO Alex Rohleder and executive Don Dadwar, had conspired to oust him from his own company. According to the filing, they used Dan's name, image, and brand to raise capital, only to push him out once the walls began to shake. Worse, Dan alleged that his public image had been exploited without his consent, a brutal irony considering that image was the only real asset Ignite ever had. He demanded $50 million in damages, claiming the group ran a smear campaign that left him locked out of future business deals. And for once, the bravado was gone. This wasn't the cocky, cigar-puffing king of Instagram. This was a man trying to salvage something, anything, from the ashes of a life that had spun out of his control. But the irony was cruel, because while Dan fought to reclaim control, the deeper story was already out and Ignite may have never really been his in the first place. Court documents suggested that Paul Bilzerian had orchestrated the entire structure. Behind the scenes, he set up holding companies, made key financial decisions, and slashed costs when the company began to bleed out. In fact, that miraculous profit in late 2020, it only happened after Paul cut 75% of the marketing budget and shut down Dan's party-fueled spending spree. In a rare interview, Paul even admitted that Dan might have only been involved because of his fame. He said, Dan probably thought being famous meant he should own a company, but the model didn't offer much value. It was a stunning admission. Dan built the image, Paul pulled the strings, and when the brand fell apart, father and son were locked in a brutal legal war over a fantasy they built together. But if you think that's where the story ends, you'd be wrong, because after all the lawsuits, scandals, and financial chaos, Dan tried one more reinvention, and what happened next would reveal who he really is when the spotlight fades. With the mansion gone, the lawsuits piling up, and the internet no longer buying the dream, Dan Bilzerian vanished. His once daily Instagram flexes slowed to a trickle. His brash captions faded into silence. The king of lifestyle had nothing left to post. But Dan wasn't done, he was just rebranding. In 2025, he emerged with a new mission. Not as a playboy or a CEO, but as a self-help guru for men. He called it the Sigma Society. The same man who built his fame on excess, objectification, and fantasy now wanted to teach young men how to be real. Courses, books, motivational speeches, all built on a message of masculine independence, discipline, and authenticity. Except there was one massive problem. Dan's entire career had been the opposite. This was the guy who hired women to pose as girlfriends, rented homes and pretended to own them, spent investor money to host parties labeled as business expenses, claimed to be self-made while quietly relying on his father's back-end dealings. Now, he was offering life advice to the very followers who once envied his fake lifestyle. And if you thought people would just forget, they didn't. The comment sections on Sigma Society posts became war zones. Some followers mocked the pivot, calling it Andrew Tate Light. Others called it a cash grab from a man whose reputation was in freefall. But Dan pressed on, posting clips of himself giving advice, quoting stoicism, and framing his past failures as lessons. "I'm tired of being hated," he said in a rare podcast appearance. "I just want to live my life now and be left alone." It was the first time Dan sounded human. No bravado, no filters, just a man who had everything and lost almost all of it. But here's the real question: is the Sigma Society a sincere evolution or just another mask for the same old persona? A new script, same actor. Because while Dan may have changed his wardrobe, the audience still remembers the last movie and how badly it ended. Dan Bilzerian once said he didn't care what people thought of him, but the numbers told a different story. By mid-2024, his Instagram growth, once a rocket ship, flatlined. No more 100K likes on shirtless yacht photos, no more viral party videos, just silence. His follower count didn't just stall, it dropped fast. Over 60,000 followers vanished in less than 6 months. On March 31st, 2024, a brutal milestone. Over 5,000 unfollows in a single day. Even worse, the engagement tanked. The likes, the comments, the buzz, all gone. The algorithm that once worshipped him had moved on. And for someone who built his identity on being seen, that kind of digital death hits different. Then came the stock. Ignite, the company that funded his fantasy, was delisted, quietly. No press release, no statement. One moment it was there, the next, gone. Like it had never existed. By 2025, Ignite was facing an SEC lawsuit for allegedly publishing fake financial statements. Dan's own father had reappeared in a strange interview trying to explain it all, while Dan himself stayed silent, and in that silence, the myth unraveled. Fans who once idolized him started connecting the dots. The poker wins? Unverified. The cars? Rented. The women? Paid. The company? Bleeding money. The empire? Built on smoke and hashtags. Even Sigma Society, his latest reinvention, couldn't erase that truth. And here's the part no one talks about. Dan didn't go out in flames, he didn't crash, he just faded. like an aging magician whose tricks stopped working. No scandalous arrest, no epic downfall, just a slow, painful unraveling, watched by millions who once cheered him on. The man who once shouted from the rooftops now whispers into the void of social media, hoping someone's still listening. But even his most loyal fans can't help but wonder, was Dan Bilzerian ever real?
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to Stars and Hypes so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how things will continue. Drop them in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, take care and have a great day.